Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Best Practices in Adverse Event, otherwise known as AE reporting in clinical trials. My versatile colleague and an expert of numerous clinical trials, Ms. Melanie Miller, is going to discuss both the strategic as well as tactical aspects of this very important topic in clinical trials. So, welcome back to the chat, Ms. Melanie.
Thanks for having me back, Jay.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So I'd like to get into the details of AE reporting. And for those who are perhaps new to this video, please take a look at the previous video that Melanie did, and she went into great details of effective and efficient reporting in safety management as far as clinical trials is concerned. So moving on, Melanie, can you please help us understand what is an AE in the context of a medical device and or an IVD trial? And how does reporting in medical device trials differ from drugs or even biologics?
Sure. So for the FDA in the United States, an adverse event is any undesirable experience that would be associated with the use of a medical product, whether it be a device or a pharmaceutical product, in a patient, regardless of the relationship. So what this means is whether the event is related to the product or unrelated to the product. It is an undesirable experience and it needs to be reported as an adverse event. And then for EU MDR, which is the European guidance, an adverse event, similar definition, but a little bit more detailed. It's any untoward medical occurrence, unintended disease or injury, or any untoward clinical signs, including any abnormal laboratory finding in subjects, users, or other persons in the context of a clinical investigation, whether or not related to the investigational device or investigational pharmaceutical product. And so with that, you do have different regulations. And so you have your device regulations that focus on medical devices. And for that, there's kind of a little bit more interpretation that's needed compared to the drug regulations. And so this is mainly due to the fact that in a medical device, the regulations cover a Band-Aid all the way to an implantable device. Right. So all of those are devices. Right. And so with that, there's kind of also varying uses of those devices from therapeutic versus diagnostic, right? So they go into different categories. So then how you evaluate that AE and report that AE in those studies is very different, and it's usually defined in the protocol. Whereas in a pharmaceutical study, all AEs are collected and reported because you're putting a biologic typically into your body. And so all the AEs are reported, from a cough to a fever to a sneeze, a cold, you stubbed your toe. Those are all reported in your pharmaceutical studies, and they're all analyzed to the relationship of the product. So two very different ways. They're both very much driven in studies driven by the regulations and the protocol, though, as well. So those are key things to keep in mind when it's looking at AE reporting. Okay.
Well, now that we know what constitutes the definition of what is an AE, right, from a global studies perspective, what's the minimum data set required to consider information as a reportable AE?
So this is really a simple question. It might sound like it would be more, but it's very much, you need to have an identifiable subject. So you need to have some information about your subject. Typically, it's a patient identification number, some medical history about the patient. It could be some statistics in terms of weight, age. It really depends on what the study protocol defines, but you need that identifiable subject with that subject information. 2, you need an investigational product, and you need details about that product. So you need to have the name of the device or the pharmaceutical, and then also details about that product. And then 3rd is your AE. So you need information about the actual event. And this typically includes a description of the event, a start date, an end date, if there was any treatment or action that was done in order to either help to resolve the event. If there was any, for a pharmaceutical study, was there any action taken to the pharmaceutical product? So was the product increased, decreased dose? Was it taken away? For a device study, if it was an implantable, was that device removed? Was there a revision done? Was, something needing to happen to the device? And then lastly, you need your reporter information. So typically it's information of who reported it. So is it patient reported? Was it reported by the site coordinator, the PI? That's all important information when it's looking at the event. And that's really all we need.
Okay.
And then the rest is all extra to help us analyze the event. So after we have this initial information, typically then we will, from a safety standpoint, we will look at the event a little bit in more detail. And that's when we may request source documents, progress notes from, a visit or a hospital stay, if there was a hospital admission or any type of imaging or that would be needed to evaluate the event fully.
Got it. Okay. So what are the governing principles and perhaps even guidelines for AE reporting in a global study?
Sure. So in a global study, that's when you're looking at a study that would have US and EU countries participating. You would follow the regulatory guidelines for both countries. And so under the EU Medical Device Regulation, Article 80, it defines AE reporting for both pre and post-market studies. And then additionally, in the European countries, there's 27 member states that also have their own regulations that we would have to adhere to. And within those 27 member states, they have national competent authorities, which also have regulations. So regulations in Europe are a little bit more complicated. We would look at the EU MDR regulations and then whatever countries we're specifically having sites at. And then in the US, we follow the FDA guidance for clinical investigators, sponsors, and IRBs for AE reporting. And then we also follow either 21 CFR 312 for investigational new product devices for pharmaceuticals, or we're following 21 CFR 812, which is for investigational devices. For timelines. And then within each of those guidances, there's expedited reporting timelines for serious and unexpected AEs. And so what we do is we look at those guidelines and then we will build those into a safety management plan to ensure that all countries are followed, and we work those into our AE reporting timelines. And then also too, lastly, you have your GCP and your ISO 14155/2020, and that kind of harmonizes all your AE reporting across all countries and regions. So it's kind of a layer of regs that we follow, but we're, it's very important to make sure that you align to, and that everything is covered within your protocol and you're not missing anything when it comes to those expedited timelines. Even though a lot of the countries, they're similar, very similar. Typically, an expedited event is 7 days or 10 to 15 days. It varies across mostly your EU countries. But for the most part, they all align. And so, we work when we have an event that meets that criteria to make sure that, everyone involved, we meet the timeline accordingly.
Got it. Okay. Well, how does AE reporting differ with study type, prospective versus retrospective, registry versus maybe an RCT? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so pivotal studies, we'll start with that. So they mainly are studies to establish the safety efficacy for regulatory approval of the product. So AE reporting for these are very much defined in the protocol, as well as the IFU, which is the investigational for use manual. And then it also may be in additional documents that are specific to the safety reporting or for the device. And this is mostly device studies that I'm speaking to too. And so we
Right.
focus then on pivotal studies reporting. We focus on severity grading and then causality relationship to the product and the event. And then, of course, we adhere to the requirements of FDA and the European requirements. And then post-market studies, most people don't realize, but AE reporting really plays a crucial role in these studies as well, because we're looking at the ongoing safety and effectiveness of this product. So what does the safety and effectiveness look like after this product has been approved and it's been on the market? Is it still meeting those standards that it was approved under? So typically for these products, we're looking at more of safety signals and risks that maybe were not present prior when the device was approved. Anything that would trigger a label update, a recall, or some type of new safety communication to the regulatory authorities. And then you have your registries, lastly, and your randomized controlled trials. And so registries, as we all know, are really observational studies, mostly where we're collecting data on large cohorts of patients, and it's typically a specific condition or maybe a treatment in a clinical setting. And again, we're using these studies to look at safety signals and long-term safety profiles. So the AE reporting is mostly spontaneous reporting, and it's any events that would occur during routine care of these patients. So we're collecting more events typically for these studies and then going through and reviewing them and determining what events need to be reported and what events do not need to be reported as it relates to the study or the outcomes of this study. And then our prospective studies, those are the trials that are your controlled studies. So they're typically randomized, and you typically have 2 cohorts or arms, and they are really looking at comparison of the safety and the efficacy outcomes of these patients. And so AE reporting is very protocol driven. There's very much a predefined criteria that's typically followed so that they can have a standardized data collection. And again, we follow the regulatory requirements and the guidelines for the countries that it's conducted in. But it's more detailed in prospective studies. There's usually more events that are collected than typical to your registry studies. And they're very much defined by the study endpoints, as well as the study objectives. And so that's the guiding kind of what guides the reporting process.
Excellent. Melanie, thank you so much for sharing tips and best practices on AE reporting. Thinking back to my time as a reviewer in the EU, this is an area of significant focus whenever a clinical data set comes in, both for prospective as well as retrospective studies, both for pre-market as well as post-market studies. So it's an area that manufacturers can definitely use some guidance on, and it's an area that you have dabbled with consistently throughout your career. So thank you very much once again for sharing your expertise and experience in this area. Appreciate the help and the assistance, Melanie. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me.